Chapter 14 of Against the Grain. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Against the Grain by Joris, Karl, Huysmans. Translated by John Howard. Chapter 14, Part 2. Notwithstanding the majestic form and the imposing quality of his verse, which struck such a brilliant note that even the hexameters of Hugo seemed pale in comparison, Le Comte de Lisle could no longer satisfy him. The antiquity so marvelously restored by Flaubert remained cold and immobile in his hands. Nothing palpitated in his verses which lacked depth, and which most often contained no idea. Nothing moved in those gloomy waste poems whose impassive mythologies ended by finally leaving him cold. Too, after having long delighted in Gautier, Des Esseintes reached the point where he no longer cared for him. The admiration he felt for this man's incomparable painting had gradually dissolved. Now he was more astonished than ravished by his descriptions. Objects impressed themselves upon Gautier's perceptive eyes, but they went no further, they never penetrated deeper into his brain and flesh. Like a giant mirror, this writer constantly limited himself to reflecting surrounding objects with impersonal clearness. Certainly Des Esseintes still loved the works of these two poets, as he loved rare stones and precious objects, but none of the variations of these perfect instrumentalists could hold him longer, neither being evocative of reverie, neither opening, for him at least, broad roads of escape to beguile the tedium of dragging hours. These two books left him unsatisfied, and it was the same with Hugo. The oriental and patriarchal side was too conventional and barren to detain him, and his manners, at once childish and that of a grandfather, exasperated him. He had to go to the Chanson des Rues et des Bois to enjoy the perfect acrobatics of his metrics. But how gladly, after all, would he not have exchanged all this tour de force for a new work by Baudelaire, which might equal the others, for he decidedly was almost the only one whose verses, under their splendid form, contained a healing and nutritive substance. In passing from one extreme to the other, from form deprived of ideas to ideas deprived of form, Des Esseintes remained no less circumspect and cold. The psychological labyrinths of Stendhal, the analytical detours of Duranty seduced him, but their administrative, colourless and arid language, their static prose, fit at best for the wretched industry of the theatre, repelled him. Then their interesting works and their astute analyses applied to brains agitated by passions in which he was no longer interested. He was not at all concerned with general affections or points of view, with associations of common ideas, now that the reserve of his mind was more keenly developed, and that he no longer admitted aught but superfine sensations and catholic or sensual torments. To enjoy a work which should combine, according to his wishes, incisive style with penetrating and feline analysis, he had to go to the master of induction, the profound and strange Edgar Allan Poe, for whom, since the time when he reread him, his preference had never wavered. More than any other, perhaps, he approached, by his intimate affinity, Des Esseintes' meditative cast of mind. If Baudelaire, in the hieroglyphics of the soul, had deciphered the return of the age of sentiment and ideas, Poe, in the field of morbid psychology, had more especially investigated the domain of the soul. Under the emblematic title, The Demon of Perversity, he had been the first in literature to pry into the irresistible, unconscious impulses of the will, which mental pathology now explains more scientifically. He had also been the first to divulge, if not to signal, the impressive influence of fear, which acts on the will like an anaesthetic, paralyzing sensibility, and like the curare, stupefying the nerves. It was on the problem of the lethargy of the will that Poe had centered his studies, analyzing the effects of this moral poison, indicating the symptoms of its progress, the troubles commencing with anxiety, continuing through anguish, ending finally in the terror which deadens the will, without intelligence succumbing, though sorely disturbed. Death, which the dramatists had so much abused, he had in some manner changed and made more poignant by introducing an algebraic and superhuman element. But in truth, it was less the real agony of the dying person which he described, and more the moral agony of the survivor, haunted at the deathbed by monstrous hallucinations engendered by grief and fatigue. With a frightful fascination, he dwelt on acts of terror, on the snapping of the will, coldly reasoning about them, little by little making the reader gasp, suffocated and panting before these feverish, mechanically contrived nightmares. Convulsed by hereditary neurosis, maddened by a moral St. Vitus's dance, Poe's creatures lived only through their nerves. His women, the Morellas and Ligeias, possessed an immense erudition. They were steeped in the mists of German philosophy and the Kabbalistic mysteries of the Old Orient, and all had the boyish and inert breasts of angels. All were sexless. Baudelaire and Poe, these two men who had often been compared because of their common poetic strain and predilection for the examination of mental maladies, differed radically in the affective conceptions which held such a large place in their works. Baudelaire, with his iniquitous and debased loves, cruel loves which made one think of the reprisals of an inquisition; Poe, with his chaste, aerial loves, in which the senses played no part, where only the mind functioned, without corresponding to organs, which, if they existed, remained forever frozen and virgin. This cerebral clinic, where, vivisecting in a stifling atmosphere, that spiritual surgeon became, as soon as his attention flagged, a prey to an imagination which evoked, like delicious miasmas, somnambulistic and angelic apparitions, was to Des Esseintes a source of unwearying conjecture. But now that his nervous disorders were augmented, days came when his readings broke his spirit, and when, hands trembling, body alert, like the desolate usher, he was haunted by an unreasoning fear and a secret terror. Thus he was compelled to moderate his desires, and he rarely touched these fearful elixirs. in the same way that he could no longer with impunity visit his red corridor and grow ecstatic at the sight of the gloomy Odilon Redon prints and the Jan Lauken horrors. And yet, when he felt inclined to read, all literature seemed to him dull after these terrible American imported philters. Then he betook himself to Villiers de l'Isle Adam, in whose scattered works he noted seditious observations and spasmodic vibrations, but which no longer gave one, with the exception of his Clair le Noir, such troubling horror. This Clair le Noir, which appeared in 1867 in the Revue des Lettres des Arts, opened a series of tales comprised under the title of Histoire morose, where against a background of obscure speculations borrowed from old Hegel, dislocated creatures stirred. Dr. Tribula Bonhomet, solemn and childish, a Clair le Noir, farcical and sinister, with blue spectacles, round and large as franc pieces, which covered her almost dead eyes. This story centered about a simple adultery, and ended with an inexpressible terror, when Bonhomet, opening Claire's eyelids as she lies in her deathbed, and penetrating them with monstrous plummets, distinctively perceives the reflection of the husband brandishing the lover's decapitated head, while shouting a war song like a Kanaka. Based on this more or less just observation that the eyes of certain animals, cows for instance, preserve even to decomposition, like photographic plates, the image of the beings and things their eyes behold at the moment they expire, this story evidently derived from Poe, from whom he appropriated the terrifying and elaborate technique. This also applied to the Intersignes, which had later been joined to the Contes Cruels, a collection of indisputable talent in which was found Vera, which Des Esseintes considered a little masterpiece. Here the hallucination was marked with an exquisite tenderness. No longer was it the dark mirages of the American author, but the fluid, warm, almost celestial vision. It was in an identical genre, the reverse of the Beatrices and Ligeias, those gloomy and dark phantoms engendered by the inexorable nightmare of opium. This story also put in play the operations of the will, but it no longer treated of its defeats and helplessness under the effects of fear. On the contrary, it studied the exaltations of the will under the impulse of a fixed idea. It demonstrated its power, which often succeeded in saturating the atmosphere and in imposing its qualities on surrounding objects. Another book by Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Isis, seemed to him curious in other respects. The philosophic medley of Clair le Noir was evident in this work, which offered an unbelievable jumble of verbal and troubled observations, souvenirs of old melodramas, poniards and rope ladders, all the romanticism which Villiers de l'Isle Adam could never rejuvenate in his Hélène and Morgane, forgotten pieces published by an obscure man, Sieur Francisque Guillon. The heroine of this book, Marquise Tullia Fabriana, reputed to have assimilated the Chaldean science of the women of Edgar Allan Poe and the diplomatic sagacities of Stendhal, had the enigmatic countenance of Bradamante abused by an antique Circe. These insoluble mixtures developed a fuliginous vapor across which philosophic and literary influences jostled without being able to be regulated in the author's brain when he wrote the prolegomenae of this work, which could not have embraced less than 7 volumes. But there was another side to Villier's temperament. It was piercing and acute in an altogether different sense. A side of forbidding pleasantry and fierce raillery. No longer was it the paradoxical mystifications of Poe, but a scoffing that had in it the lugubrious and savage comedy which Swift possessed. A series of sketches, Les Demoiselles de Bienfilâtre, L'Affichage Céleste, La Machine à Gloire, and Le Plus Beau Dîner du Monde, betrayed a singularly inventive and keenly bantering mind. The whole order of contemporary and utilitarian ideas, the whole commercialized baseness of the age, were glorified in stories whose poignant irony transported Des Esseintes. No other French book had been written in this serious and bitter style. At the most, a tale by Charles Cros, La Science de l'Amour, printed long ago in the Revue du Monde Nouveau, could astonish by reason of its chemical whims, by its affected humour, and by its coldly facetious observations. But the pleasure to be extracted from the story was merely relative, since its execution was a dismal failure. The firm, coloured, and often original style of Villiers had disappeared to give way to a mixture scraped on the literary bench of the first comer. Heavens, heavens, how few books are really worth re-reading, sighed Des Esseintes, gazing at the servant who left the stool on which he had been perched, to permit Des Esseintes to survey his books with a single glance. Des Esseintes nodded his head. But 2 small books remained on the table. With a sigh he dismissed the old man, and turned over the leaves of a volume bound in onager skin, which had been glazed by a hydraulic press and speckled with silver clouds. It was held together by fly-leaves of old silk damask, whose faint patterns held that charm of faded things celebrated by Mallarmé in an exquisite poem. These pages, numbering 9, had been extracted from copies of the 2 first Parnassian books. It was printed on parchment paper and preceded by this title, Quelques vers de Mallarmé, designed in a surprising calligraphy in uncial letters, illuminated and relieved with gold, as in old manuscripts. Among the 11 poems brought together in these covers, several invited him: Les Fenêtres, L'Epilogue, and Azur. But one among them all, a fragment of the Hérodiade, held him at certain hours in a spell. How often, beneath the lamp that threw a low light on the silent chamber, had he not felt himself haunted by this Hérodiade, who in the work of Gustave Moreau was now plunged in gloom, revealing but a dim white statue in a brazier extinguished by stones. The darkness concealed the blood, the reflections, and the golds, hid the temple's farther sides, drowned the supernumeraries of the crime enshrouded in their dead colours, and, only sparing the aquarelle whites, revealed the woman's jewels and heightened her nudity. At such times he was forced to gaze upon her unforgotten outlines, and she lived for him, her lips articulating those bizarre and delicate lines which Mallarmé makes her utter. Ô miroir, eau froide par l'ennui dans ton cadre gelé, que de fois, et pendant les heures, désolé des songes et cherchant mes souvenirs qui sont comme des feuilles sous ta glace au trou profond, je m'apparus en toi comme une ombre lointaine. Mais, horreur, des soirs dans ta sévère fontaine, j'ai de mon rêve épars connu la nudité. These lines he loved, as he loved the works of this poet, who in an age of democracy devoted to lucre, lived his solitary and literary life sheltered by his disdain from the encompassing stupidity, delighting far from society in the surprises of the intellect, in cerebral visions, refining on subtle ideas, grafting Byzantine delicacies upon them, perpetuating them in suggestions lightly connected by an almost imperceptible thread. These twisted and precious ideas were bound together with an adhesive and secret language full of phrase contractions, ellipses, and bold tropes. Perceiving the remotest analogies with a single term which by an effect of similitude at once gave the form, the perfume, the colour and the quality, he described the object or being to which otherwise he would have been compelled to place numerous and different epithets so as to disengage all their facets and nuances, had he simply contented himself with indicating the technical name. Thus he succeeded in dispensing with the comparison, which formed in the reader's mind by analogy as soon as the symbol was understood. Neither was the attention of the reader diverted by the enumeration of the qualities which the juxtaposition of adjectives would have induced. Concentrating upon a single word, he produced, as for a picture, the ensemble, a unique and complete aspect. It became a concentrated literature, an essential unity, a sublimate of art. This style was at first employed with restraint in his earlier works, but Mallarmé had boldly proclaimed it in a verse on Théophile Gautier and in L'après-midi du faune, an eclogue where the subtleties of sensual joys are described in mysterious and caressing verses, suddenly pierced by this wild, rending faune cry. Alors m'éveillerai-je à la ferveur première, droit et seul, sous un flot antique de lumière. Lis, et l'un de vous tous pour l'ingénuité. That line with the monosyllable lis, like a sprig, evoked the image of something rigid, slender, and white. It rhymed with the substantive ingénuité, allegorically expressing by a single term the passion, the effervescence, the fugitive mood of a virgin faun amorously distracted by the sight of nymphs. In this extraordinary poem, surprising and unthought of images leaped up at the end of each line, when the poet described the elations and regrets of the faun contemplating at the edge of a fen the tufts of reeds still preserving in its transitory mould the form made by the naiads who had occupied it. Then Des Esseintes also experienced insidious delights in touching this diminutive book, whose cover of Japan vellum, as white as curdled milk, were held together by two silk bands, one of Chinese rose, the other of black. Hidden behind the cover, the black band rejoined the rose, which rested like a touch of modern Japanese paint, or like a lascivious adjutant against the antique white, against the candid carnation tint of the book, and enlaced it, united its sombre colour with the light colour into a light rosette. It insinuated a faint warning of that regret, a vague menace of that sadness which succeeds the ended transports and the calmed excitements of the senses. Des Esseintes placed L'Après-midi du Faune on the table and examined another little book he had printed, an anthology of prose poems, a tiny chapel placed under the invocation of Baudelaire and opening on the parvise of his poems. This anthology comprised a selection of Gaspard de la Nuit, of that fantastic Aloysius Bertrand, who had transferred the behavior of Leonard in prose, and with his metallic oxides painted little pictures whose vivid colors sparkle like those of clear enamels. To this Des Esseintes had joined Le Vox Populi of Villiers, a superb piece of work in a hammered golden style after the manner of Leconte de Lisle and of Flaubert, and some selections from that delicate Livre de Jade, whose exotic perfume of ginseng and of tea blends with the odorous freshness of water babbling along the book under moonlight. But in this collection had been gathered certain poems resurrected from defunct reviews: Le démon de l'analogie, La pipe, Le pauvre enfant pâle, Le spectacle interrompu, Le phénomène futur, and especially Plainte d'automne and Frisson d'hiver, which were Mallarmé's masterpieces, and were also celebrated among the masterpieces of prose poems, for they united such a magnificently delicate language that they cradled, like a melancholy incantation or a maddening melody, thoughts of an irresistible suggestiveness, pulsations of the soul of a sensitive person whose excited nerves vibrate with a keenness which penetrates ravishingly and induces a sadness. Of all the forms of literature, that of the prose poem was the form Des Esseintes preferred. Handled by an alchemist of genius, it contained in its slender volume the strength of the novel, whose analytic developments and descriptive redundancies it suppressed. Quite often Des Esseintes had meditated on that disquieting problem: to write a novel concentrated in a few phrases, which should contain the essence of hundreds of pages always employed to establish the setting, to sketch the characters, and to pile up observations and minute details. Then the chosen words would be so unexchangeable that they would do duty for many others, the adjective placed in such an ingenious and definite fashion that it could not be displaced, opening such perspectives that the reader could dream for whole weeks on its sense, at once precise and complex, could record the present, reconstruct the past, divine the future of the souls of the characters revealed by the gleams of this unique epithet. Thus conceived and condensed in a page or two, the novel could become a communion of thought between a magical writer and an ideal reader, a spiritual collaboration agreed to between 10 superior persons scattered throughout the universe, a delight offered to the refined and accessible to them alone. To Des Esseintes, the prose poem represented the concrete juice of literature, the essential oil of art. That succulence, developed and concentrated into a drop, already existed in Baudelaire and in those poems of Mallarmé which he read with such deep joy. When he had closed his anthology, Des Esseintes told himself that his books, which had ended on this last book, would probably never have anything added to it. In fact, the decadence of a literature, irreparably affected in its organism, enfeebled by old ideas, exhausted by excesses of syntax, sensitive only to the curiosities which make sick persons feverish, and yet intent upon expressing everything in its decline, eager to repair all the omissions of enjoyment, to bequeath the most subtle memories of grief in its deathbed, was incarnate in Mallarme, in the most perfect, exquisite manner imaginable. Here were the quintessences of Baudelaire and of Poe. Here were their fine and powerful substances distilled and disengaging new flavors and intoxications. It was the agony of the old language which, after having become mouldy from age to age, ended by dissolving, by reaching that deliquescence of the Latin language which expired in the mysterious concepts and the enigmatical expressions of Saint Boniface and Saint Adhelme. The decomposition of the French language had been effected suddenly. In the Latin language, a long transition, a distance of 400 years existed between the spotted and superb epithet of Claudian and Rutilius and the gamey epithet of the 8th century. In the French language, no lapse of time, no succession of ages had taken place. The stained and superb style of the de Goncourt and the gamey style of Verlaine and Mallarme jostled in Paris, living in the same period, epoch and century. And Des Esseintes, gazing at one of the folios opened on his chapel desk, smiled at the thought that the moment would soon come when an erudite scholar would prepare for the decadence of the French language a glossary similar to that in which the savant Ducange has noted the last murmurings, the last spasms, the last flashes of the Latin language dying of old age in the cloisters and sounding its death rattle. End of chapter 14. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.